The history of this movement is embedded in 400 years of history. John Winthrop, founder of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630, the man who first spoke of this land as a city upon a hill. It was John Smith, co-founder of Jamestown, Virginia in 1608. There are many founding fathers, as we call them, of the United States. They were deists and theists mostly, even secularists, though most probably had ties to a Christian denomination. They certainly were not today's version of evangelical Christians with what evangelicals now call a biblical worldview. By birth, true confession, by birth I belong to this group, which has always been a minority in this nation. White, European, heterosexual, male, and Protestant Christian. Historically, this minority believed that privilege, power, and wealth were our birthright, even the divine order. This is the story we told, the narrative we crafted, the myth taught to our children. When we were challenged, we passed laws and used the courts and violence, if necessary, to enforce that privilege and power. None of that is new. In Virginia, in the 1600s, white men created slave laws and the slavery code, which declared they had the right to own men as property. Over the next 2 centuries, white men continued to write the laws, embed them in the Constitution, and enforce them with violence if necessary. What is called the Great Replacement theory, spoken of at the Reawaken America event, is rooted in this historical narrative. The white minority in the South especially were always afraid they would lose their power or their property or even their lives if black people gained power. It goes back at least to Virginia in the 1600s with their slave laws, and to Reconstruction after the Civil War when black men could first vote and began electing other black men to Congress and to state and local office. Most of these white men were professing Christians. Their ministers and theologians preached and wrote theology to reinforce it all. Robert P. Jones in The End of White Christian America and its sequel, White Too Long, has detailed this tragic history. The Christian churches in America have been complicit, if not outright leaders, in this history of white supremacy. In White Too Long, he describes what became the Southern myth. He writes, Reconstruction was generally represented as a time when white Southerners were victimized by vengeful occupying federal forces who supported black politicians primarily as a way of humiliating their defeated enemies. Southern whites were victims who were dishonorably treated after fighting a noble war. They had lost the war, but they would not lose their culture and their home. They would not have black people replace them or their enemies govern them. So many slogans of today's movement are rooted in this history, and they refer not just to black people, but all people of color and to Jews as well. They will not replace us. Take back our country. Or the language constantly used of demonizing their enemy and seeing themselves as the victim. The story continues through to the present day, when the history of what this movement calls a Christian nation is still being lived out by people who are afraid their country has been stolen from them and they are being replaced. Heather Cox Richardson writes about that history in How the South Won the Civil War. She writes, the Republican Party had formed in the 1850s as a Northern party, and it had largely stayed in the North. After the Civil War, Republicans had to figure out how to build a national party if they were to stay in power. In the presidential election of 1880, the South went solidly against the Republicans, and it would stay that way until the 1970s. So Republicans began to look west to resurrect their fortunes. Today, the South and the West especially are home to Christian nationalism, and Republicans are in power in the South and the West, with Democrats more in the North and the urban centers. All of that has flipped, and there is no truth to what some in the movement are now saying, that today's Republicans are the heirs of Republicans responsible for freeing the slaves. It's just the opposite. Nancy MacLean, another historian, picks up the story in the 1950s and 60s in her book, Democracy in Chains, The Deep History of the Radical Right Stealth Plan for America. Her focus is not on Christian nationalism, but it overlaps. Here's what she says. The new conservative movement made the headway they did in the South because, in their essence, their stands were so familiar. Goldwater did best in the part of Virginia, like that of the nation as a whole, that was most resistant to civil rights reform. White Southerners who opposed racial equality and economic justice knew from their own region's history that the only way they could protect their desired way of life was to keep federal power at bay, so that majoritarian democracy could not reach into the region. Sarah Posner covers this movement in a more focused way in her book, Unholy. She writes especially about white evangelicals in the days of Donald Trump, but what she describes fits the movement as it has grown over the past 50 years. And her description fits what I experienced in Batavia at the Reawaken America event. She writes in her book about anointed leaders who represent themselves as modern-day prophets and apostles, able to receive revelations directly from God. Revelation knowledge supersedes facts and reason. God's strongman, Donald Trump, in her book, articulates their shared grievances, that alien, anti-Christian, anti-American ideologies have taken over the government, judiciary, media, education, and even popular culture, and forced edicts upon a besieged white Christian majority, cowing them into submission by invoking political correctness that aims to censor, silence, and oppress them. Many speakers in the Reawaken America tour deny the charge against them of promoting white supremacy and violence. They point out that a third of the dozens of speakers are black, although 95% of the audience was white, and that there was no violence in and around the event, although there were personal bodyguards and armed security and visually violent images. However, the myth of a Christian nation chosen by God dominated the whole event, and this nation, of course, has historically been controlled by white men. The ideas and language of systemic racism and white supremacy are anathema to this movement. Only individual responsibility matters to them, and racism only exists in their minds if an individual consciously hates a person of another color. That same core belief leads to a denial of hate being part of their movement. In their minds, they don't hate their enemies. Liberals, Democrats, LGBTQ folks, and Jews, for instance, they just oppose them because, in their words, they are evil. Strange reasoning to us, perhaps, but there it is. In his testimony before the House Select Committee investigating the January 6th attack on the Capitol, Judge J. Michael Luttig spoke about a clear and present danger in this nation. As a lifelong Republican, he said that Republicans must start speaking to Democrats as fellow Americans that have a shared destiny and shared hopes and dreams for America.